True Crime Talks presents an exclusive interview with the man who took down the Teflon Don, John Gleeson. As a determined young prosecutor, Gleeson went head-to-head with one of America's most dangerous criminals and won. In this book, The Gotti Wars, Gleeson shares his incredible journey in the battle against the notorious mob boss and his ruthless crew. One quote from the book that perfectly captures the essence of this thrilling true crime story is, "The streets of New York was a chessboard, and the Gotti was the king. But even the king can be toppled when the right moves are made." Join us along with Angela Tucci as she sits down with John Gleeson for an in-depth conversation about his relentless pursuit of justice, the shocking portrayal of Sammy the Bull Gravano, and the ultimate downfall of the mafia's grip on the five boroughs.
Right. I'm Angela Macropolis, and I'm very, very excited to lead this discussion. I will say, I don't want to sound like too much of a fangirl, but I've known about John Gleeson for 30 years. And John will meet in person in October. I've known about you from the final conviction. I am, just for my background, I'm also an attorney. I'm not a litigator. I am a corporate lawyer specializing in employee benefits. I'm also a freelance reporter. I went to journalism school much later in life, but I've been practicing over 30 years. And the reason I know about John Gleeson is because I am a native New Yorker. I followed the trial, and also right after the conviction, you interviewed a then boyfriend of mine for an assistant U.S. attorney position in the Eastern District. He didn't get it. My ex-boyfriend, I wasn't sorry about that. He was. We're not together anymore. And
John Gleason's a good judge of character too.
Yes, and I was excited to read this book, in part because for those of us who grew up in and around New York and are of a certain age and thought you knew a lot of stuff around the story of organized crime and the mafia. And I'll probably be sharing a little more about my background, my personal history. There was a lot I didn't know. And there's a lot of names that are familiar to people from New York that were resonant to me. So it's a great honor to interview you on this book. So I want to start asking some questions, and I know you've watched some of your interviews and read a lot of the book reviews. So let me start with some basics, which was, I've understood that this book was long in the making, that you had taken notes along the way. Is that true? Did you journal the whole way through over the course of these years?
Well, first of all, let me begin by thanking you for having me as part of this talk. Thanks for the kind words. I'm very grateful and flattered to hear them. And before I answer your question, let me say that the most overwhelming part of the response to the book is of a piece with what you just said, which is the people who lived, who were adults or young adults during this period of time really find this book resonates with them, because these are, it was a very unique time in New York. It's hard for young people now to appreciate the microscope organized crime was under, we were under. This was all pre-9/11 and pre-terrorism. So thanks for your reaction. It makes me feel all the more gratified that I got the book across the finish line. As to your question, I didn't keep a journal all the way through, although I did have, one of the things I learned writing this book is how fallible everybody's recollection is, including my own. I've learned that people remember kind of what they want to remember the way they want to remember it. And for that reason, although a great deal of what's in the book was written within a couple of years, 2 or 3 years of the trial, especially the parts about Gravano flipping and the like, I found it essential to get the U.S. Attorney's files from the book, to get all the court records, all the courtroom transcripts, because as I went back over what I had written, I found, my recollection is no better than anybody else's. There were things that happened that I'd forgotten. There were things that I didn't think I'd forgotten, but they happened a little differently than I remembered them. So among many other things I hope the book accomplishes is it is an absolute, dead-on, accurate historical record of those extraordinary events in the Eastern District of New York over that 10-year period.
Okay, so to that point, and why don't you talk a little bit about, and this is probably outside the true crime theme, but the challenges you felt. I think there were two themes that really came through to me. Again, specific, I think, as a lawyer and knowing some people that were both in Southern and Eastern District. The challenges you felt as a young lawyer, prosecutor, coming out of big law, coming out of Cravath Swain-Moore, between the Eastern District, which was then considered scrappier, not as elegant, without the gravitas, Southern District, and internecine battles with the FBI. I found all of that very interesting in terms of the prosecution. Like, you were battling within what should have been a more unitary or unified movement to prosecute bad actors.
Absolutely. And the odd thing about it, and just to put a little backdrop to that, that first case against John Gotti, the 7-month-long trial that resulted in acquittals, had, right before I joined the office, was indicted by Diane Jackalone and the U.S. Attorney Ray Deary. And right before they were going to return the indictment, prosecutors don't know who informants are in organized crime. FBI holds that information dearly and close to its vest. But the indictment contained 2 organized crime informants, one of them, Willie Boy Johnson, a TE, a top echelon informant. And the Bureau came to Ray Deary, the U.S. Attorney, and to Diane, the lead prosecutor, and said, "You can't do this. These are prized assets of ours in the fight against organized crime. You can't indict them." And to my mind, to their credit, they said, "Well, yes, we can, because your prized assets work on both sides of the street, and one of them was under indictment for murder." So the FBI walked away from the case completely. And there's many types of cases federal prosecutors do that can be done without the FBI, but you just can't do a big, sophisticated La Cosa Nostra case. They don't really exist anymore, but back then you couldn't do it without the FBI. So the FBI wasn't working with us in some respects, and the details of which, are probably just going to need to look at the book for us to have time to repeat them here. But in some respects, there were folks in the Bureau, still unidentified, who worked against us, who did what seems completely anathema to an FBI organized crime investigator, which was to actually help the defendants in an indicted case win motion practice. So yes, it was completely bizarre. And just to put yourself in the shoes I was in, I was brand new. I didn't know from organized crime cases. I didn't fully appreciate how extraordinarily unique the situation was to not only not have the support of the FBI, but to be working against it. I learned, over time, over the next several years, I did cases with the FBI and then with the Gambino squad, and ultimately was the lead prosecutor in this successful case, and learned what a huge difference it is to have them on your team, because nobody does it better than when it comes to electronic surveillance and informant information and handling witnesses and getting a case trial ready with prosecutors than does the FBI. But I didn't really appreciate it at the time. I just had my head down trying to help Diane do the best we could with what we had, which wasn't much. But it was as the judge pointed out to me several times during the 2 years that ended with the 7-month trial, he said, "You've got yourself a really bad situation here because you don't have the government on your side." And truth be told, we didn't.
I know. I think that I found that very surprising. And did you think that was I saw that as a turning point in your personal development as a lawyer. I assume you feel the same.
I do. And you appreciate this. You're a lawyer, and I'm glad you're not a litigator. I'm up to my ears in litigators. Happy to talk to a lawyer who's not a litigator. But an ironic feature of all that was this. Diane and I prosecuted that case on our own. No paralegals, no case agents. 94 witnesses. I put on 70 of them. Usually lawyers spend, half a dozen or a dozen trials growing up as a trial lawyer. But because of that confluence of circumstances, which ended in disaster, ended in those humiliating acquittals, the weird benefit to me was, in one case, I honestly just grew up as a trial lawyer. Put on 70 witnesses, did a 2-hour cross of a hostile defense witness. So I found myself, Diane and I found ourselves in rubble at the end of it. And, the world is still not forgiving of women lawyers who don't succeed the first time. It certainly wasn't then. So it's kind of spelled the end of her career. But the world is more forgiving of young men lawyers for sure. And I had a second chance. And what that experience did for me was enable me literally to grow up as a trial lawyer in one case, and prepared me. I mean, after that acrimonious, hostile 7-month affair where they had a defense witness who accused me of suborning perjury, and the defendants were all acquitted. Everything was gravy for me after that. Nobody's ever had a trial that terrible an experience. And it was my first go-round. So ever since then, it seemed like a cakewalk.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit. I'm sorry to step on it, but I was going to jump to this because there are a lot of characters in this book. And to be perfectly blunt, I'm half Sicilian American. Don't hold that against me.
Never would.
And I grew up and live in a town, which I will get to at the end of this discussion, which was the home of the OG, the original gangster. So if you can guess it, you can chime in, but we'll get to it at the end. But there's a lot of characters in this book. What? Anyway, so let's get to Matt Trainer, which is to talk about how he tried to ruin your life, essentially, about suborning perjury and accusing your wife, your first wife, of horrible things, and how you came to handle that.
Sure. Well, look, Matt Trainer cast of characters in that first trial consisted of a bunch of very low-level wannabe gangsters who were working off cases, who provided accomplice testimony for us. It wasn't great evidence. It was evidence. It was enough. In many circumstances, it would be plenty. And one of that rather long list of not so savory characters was this Matt Trainer, because he had done some hijackings at the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club with some of the Gottis. He tried to shake Diane and me down for favors when he was in custody, awaiting the first trial. He made the huge mistake of saying, if you don't give me what I want, and I forgot what it was. It was either some sneakers or a visit from someone, but he wanted something. We said no. He said, if you don't give it to me, I'm going to tell the defense lawyers you told me to lie. And he thought he would just get his way, but it got his way off of our witness list. So we took him off our witness list, sent him back to state court custody, thought that was the end of Matt Trainer. He shows up, a year later as a defense witness and says that I and my first wife, who was a psychiatric nurse at Beth Israel, tried to suborn perjury from him in the form of false testimony that John Gotti committed a murder in exchange for narcotic drugs. And if that sounds bad, it's because it is, but it was nothing compared to what he then accused sexual affairs. So, there we were after only to face a defense witness who accused us of egregious crimes, which we responded to with a month-long rebuttal case. And we thought our payoff for all of that would be, in the end of the day, there would be, convictions. But of course, at the end of the day, there were acquittals across the board. So it couldn't have worked out worse for us in that first trial.
What did you find the most surprising as you got to the final trial? What did you find the most surprising thing about the final trial to you, other than the obvious flip?
Well, surprising, I'm not sure that's the right word, but close enough, is the things that I figured had gone wrong in the first case and then how to fix them. And I was gratified, not surprised, that how much I'd learned from the first case. For example, we indicted, the first case involved 10 people, and 10 people indicted, 7 go to trial. It was way too many people, 7 crosses. The trial lasted way too long, 7 months. That humanizes defendants. It wears down prosecutors. There were 7 defendants, 8 lawyers. There were 15 of them, 2 of us. They wore us down in a war. I decided in the second case, even though with those Ravenite recordings, we could have indicted the entire family, that we were just going to indict 3 guys: John Gotti, his underboss, Sammy Gravano, and his consigliere, Frank Locascio. And everybody else would come later, and we would get in and get out. So instead of a 7-month trial, we had a 6-week trial. And instead of a courtroom full of bad guys and lawyers, I had those Gravano flipped, so I only had 2 defendants at the table. And I had the courtroom full of FBI agents. So there was an extraordinary show of force in that first case, but it was a hostile force. It was John Gotti being the celebrity boss and strutting around the courtroom, intimidating everyone. There was a different show of force in the second trial. It was the FBI. I wanted us to convey to the jury, in the way we presented our case and ourselves, that it was all over for him. We were in control now, and I didn't want the jury in any way to feel like it should be afraid to convict. I wanted to convey to them that we got him on tape, it's all over, you just do your job, and he'll go to prison for life. And so we learned from those things. We learned from not having low-level people, not even associate, not even made guys. These were coffee boys in the first trial. I decided next case we were going to have John Gotti's tape, a voice on tape in the courtroom as our evidence. All of those things made the world of difference. And it also mattered that we had the jury fully sequestered from day one, so we couldn't fix the jury the way he did in the first case.
You have talked in some other interviews since the publication of the book about the glorification of the mafia, and with a tinge of irony, Ray Liotta died today, and of course he's associated with Goodfellas. So, to that point, can you extrapolate on that in relation to your feelings in writing this book about the glorification? And you talk about it early in the book too, about sort of, I see a little bit of a conflict, a push-pull on who these people, the perception and the reality.
Sure. Yeah, as I've said before, and you've heard it, as a society, and look, I'm part of it. I'm not suggesting I'm any different than anybody else, but we really belong on a therapist's couch when it comes to the outlaws generally and LCN, La Cosa Nostra in particular. We see in them what we want to see, and we produce art that is, and now I'm talking about The Godfather and The Sopranos, not Goodfellas, not Ray's movie, because that's pretty well grounded, that one, in fact. But
so how do you think that's distinguishable? I'm interested in this because it's funny. How do you think that's distinguishable to you?
Well, look at those characters. Look at Joe Pesci. That kind of,
that's closer to reality, right?
Absolutely. Right. Absolutely. But this notion of Don Corleone resolving disputes in the community, Solomon-like, and men of honor, look, I grew up on that. I saw The Godfather so many times, I have it practically memorized. I wanted to be Tom Hagen, but that's, and it's not as though I or the great lawyers and agents who worked with me were obsessed by this. We weren't. But we couldn't help notice that there was a night and day difference between what popular culture thought of when it thought of the mob and what was actually happening. And to get more granular about it, even as we were convicting Gene Gotti, Angelo Ruggiero, these are John Gotti's brother and best friend, all of his crew members, Tony Roach, even as we're convicting them of distributing heroin, there's a lot of people in New York who are applauding John Gotti for keeping the streets drug-free, and it's just, like, this is what we want to see in them, and be damned if the facts are contrary. So, and one of the reasons it doesn't bother me that much is because, it accounts for a fascination and really an appetite for books like the one I just wrote. Many years after the events that gave rise to the book, right? People are still interested in this, and they're not interested in it just because of the reality that my book shows about the mob, but because we have this kind of backdrop of, I think going back to Jesse James and Bonnie and Clyde, we like outlaws, and he was an outlaw. That's the one thing he wore on his sleeve. He was a very serious outlaw.
Don't you think part of the thing with him was the precipitating the beginning of it? Like Castellano, I don't think anybody, I'm a few years younger than you. I'm George Stramboulis. How do you pronounce his name?
Stramboulis.
Stramboulis, and I'm half Greek, and half Sicilian American. So yeah, and he and I are the same age, and so I have vivid memories of that picture on the post with his body laying out there. And that was a very, very graphic, precipitating image. That had that not happened, that you open the book with that, and that's the open to the whole thing. Had that not happened, I mean, literally and figuratively, had that not happened, the rest of this would have not unfolded in the same way. So,
sorry.
Yeah. So
you are so right, and you're never going to find a situation where a particular event so absolutely crystallizes a person and a person's career, really, than the murder of Paul Castellano and Tommy Bilotti outside of Sparks, right? That was while we were in the run-up to the trial in the first case, right? So we got a case involving the underboss, Neil Delacroce, a captain, John Gotti, a couple of other captains. The public is not paying attention to the case at all. And, so what? There's a lot of cases like that. While we're running up to the trial in that case, he blasts his way both into the status of boss of the Gambino family, into the living rooms and the minds of everybody in America in the most brazen, violent way, right? They commit these murders at the busiest place in New York, Midtown Manhattan, the busiest time of day, rush hour, the busiest time of year, right? December 16th, right? So it's like, here I am. And that's the way he became boss. That was the way he defended his cases. He wasn't hiding behind the presumption of innocence or the burden of proof. That first case, his defense was based with the help of Bruce Cutler. Yeah, I'm the boss of the Gambino crime family. What are you going to do about it? And why should that jury have been, anything other than completely intimidated? They're supposed to control this guy. So it was a great point you make. That one event really sums up his tenure as boss. Sums up the kind of boss he was. Celebrity boss, wanted the publicity, got it. It really is like a...
Yeah, but it's also summed up his downfall, and
Yep.
and was the, and I would argue, and of course I believe you would agree because you understand the etymology to Gambino crime family, and I, in some respects, I think I do too, is the counterpoise to what the Della Croces and the Gambinos, starting with Carlo, his sons, Tommy, they didn't, this guy was flashy. He wasn't a family member. They didn't, he wasn't lighting off fireworks, right? The original family members lived in Brooklyn, then spread out in Long Island. They didn't, they didn't want the attention. They had it, but they were much more low key. That's not to suggest they weren't killers or, had carting businesses and the like, but he wanted the attention. So the flashiness was his calling card. It was also his downfall, which Gravano says.
Absolutely. And not just his downfall, the downfall of all of La Cosa Nostra, because basically what he did, you're absolutely right. All the other bosses acted like they were actual crime bosses, right? They call it organized crime for a reason. So they kind of stayed below the radar. But John Gotti decided he was going to be the first celebrity boss. And, FBI agents are human too, and you put a sharp stick in their eye by walking around with being Gambino boss on your sleeve and handing $50 bills to homeless guys. You're going to galvanize those folks who know what they're doing, not just against him and the Gambino family, but against all of the families, right? There were, back then, when I was chief of organized crime in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Brooklyn, there were 8 organized crime squads in the New York office of the FBI. There are only 5 families. Now there's half a squad devoted to Italian organized crime. So what John Gotti did was bring an end to the mob as we once knew it by bringing down the FBI on all of LCN. And the other, the 1-2 punch was he trash talked Gravano. Gravano flipped and was a seismic event in organized crime when Sammy left the defense table and became my witness.
So at this point, I'm going to ask if there's anybody, Danielle, you can help me with this because I don't know if Nina's still on. If there's anybody who has any questions, I do have 1 or 2, and I have really pointed question at the end that a funny, kind of macabre story that I want John's input on. But if there's anybody who has a question for John, love to bring them up. So Danielle, if you can help me how to do that.
I'll take care of it for you.
Okay.
Hi, Charlie. Welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Danielle. Mr. Gleason, thank you for your service for the people of the United States. I followed you when I was a young man in my early 20s. Guys like you and Diane Giacalone, who used to pass these very fancy Cadillacs parked on the sidewalk, illegally parked with no ticket. You guys made an impression upon me. I would go on to work in 3 maximum security prisons, but I also grew up with these guys. I grew up with Louis Casman's brother. I was at Michael Quoro's house, the Gambino attorney. You might remember him.
Yeah.
And recently, after all these years and retired from corrections, I finally met up with John Alight, went on a show to talk to him about a dog I rescued. Here's what was for me. When that paycheck was taken from, I pronounce his name wrong, Romuald Pysek, it became clear to me as a young man in my early 20s, this was not the team of guys that I was going to ever go with. And I recently wrote a book, and I went to newspapers.com, the accuracy of the book. And this is a name you probably don't remember, but the headlines came out that my dad stuck up a cabaret in 1956 in the gun jam with infamous Joseph Imbruglia, better known for the French Connection. That's an old name, probably don't remember that, but the FBI was looking for him in the 1980s. And I left all this. I left the potential of being with these people, and I went out to the Midwest, and I worked corrections. And I want to say to you that your work, and although the initial trials did not lead to conviction, I understood as a young man what you were up against. But you made an impression upon me. And so did prosecutor Diane Giacalone. And I will never forget that. So you did change my life.
Well, wow. Thank you for sharing that. And one thing I've learned, it didn't take me long to learn it, is people who've grown up in that environment, those environments where choices present themselves like that, know this and feel this in a way I could never hope to. One of my closest friends in life today is someone who grew up in a part of Brooklyn where a lot of organized crime members grew up. And, he ended up becoming an FBI agent, but a lot of his friends ended up on the other side of the divide from us. And, a lot of young people don't have either the wherewithal or the guidance to make those choices in the right way, because young people, as a general rule, don't really have it figured out when they make those choices. But good for you, and thank you so much for the kind words. They mean a lot to me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Jennifer. Welcome to the stage.
Hi, Danielle. Hi, Mr. Gleason, and everyone. It's so really nice to hear you talk about this. The book that Danielle has shared so far is very interesting. This is one of the cases that I always looked at. This one, the mob. Also, the drug wars and everything like that with Bumpy Johnson, those type of things. But my question was, when you were on the trial, did you ever feel like your life was threatened with your family? And especially like with the Sammy the Bull, when they call him a rat and he snitched. Did you ever feel like you would get that point to even break somebody like him?
Yeah, great questions. To the first question, with about a month left to go in the second trial, the FBI and the marshals, after the court day, pulled me into the marshal's office and said, "We have reliable informant information. There's a contract on your life." And look, I'm no hero. I found that a little anxiety producing. But, by then I was doing this for 7-8 years, had a feel for what the real risks were, and the rest for reasons we've already discussed, because he brought the FBI down on all of them. The other families, the other mobsters, didn't really love John Gotti that much. He was making life miserable for all of them. So it didn't make sense that he was in pretrial detention. It looked pretty sure he was going to go down, get convicted. We didn't really think somebody in the street would do something as dramatic as kill an agent or a prosecutor for him. So, he was what he was. So was there a little edge, a little anxiety there? Yes, but I wasn't, I didn't really feel like I was going to get blown away. And of course, once he was convicted, it wouldn't have done anybody any good to kill a prosecutor. So it only lasted about a month. On the other question, Gravano was a gangster's gangster. None of us. I was the lead prosecutor. I had great prosecutors on my team: Laura Ward, Pat Cotter, Jamie Ornstein, and Special Agent George Gabriel was my case agent. Nobody thought for a minute Gravano would ever flip. We would have thought John Gotti would flip before Gravano would flip. So when he reached out, and not the only reason, but the principal reason he reached out was he had heard a recording in the detention hearing of John Gotti trashing him to the consigliere, to Frank Locascio, and he was stunned by it and thought even if they beat our case, he might have to kill John Gotti and kill his brothers. So when Gravano reached out to meet with me, my heart was pounding, because everybody in organized crime at the time knew, Henry Hill flipped fine. That was the one Ray Liotta played. But he was just an associate, and all he could give up was that Paul Vario crew in the Lucchese family. If Gravano flipped, we knew this when he first reached out. If he flipped, it was going to be a seismic event in organized crime. It was going to change the face of organized crime. That and John Gotti having been celebrity boss. So we knew from the moment we started our little dance with Sammy, when he said he wanted to cooperate, that we were on the cusp of something as far as organized crime law enforcement is concerned. We were on the cusp of something historic, and we were. It produced pressure for us to get it right. but we knew it was going to be something huge, and it turned out to be just that.
I just have one more question. Thank you so much. Is that true that Sammy the Bull has a lot of bodies under his belt, like especially being the type of person that he was?
Yeah, he had 19 bodies. We had indicted him for, this is the way it works with organized crime. You know, you make cases against people for cases you can prove beyond the reason. Sorry, just had to cough. You know, you make cases against him. We made a case for 3 murders of Sammy. We knew he had more, and it turned out he had 16 more. And people can debate about whether you should ever strike a deal with someone like that. I'm not saying I've got a lock on the winning argument on that debate. The one thing I will say, though, is Sammy helped us put away almost 50 guys. And if you count up the number of bodies those 50 guys had, and more importantly, you count up the number of bodies they would have added to their count had we not gotten them in prison for life with Gravano's testimony, you're going to have a larger number than the ones Sammy committed. So, look, I'm not here to argue the irrevocable wisdom of our deal, but I am going to say this: it's a cost benefit thing. You want a ringside ticket to a prize fight, you pay for it. You want a ringside seat to what the inner workings of organized crime, you got to be prepared to pay for the cooperation. And I have no regrets about that deal we struck with Sammy. I think it was a great deal for law enforcement.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gleason. It's a pleasure listening to you.
Thank you.
I have a related question to the Gravano flip, and it goes to your conversation with Judge Glazer and your approach, just for the education of the audience, about the keeping it from Andrew Maloney and Mary Jo White. Again, this is for me, this is total inside baseball stuff, because Andrew Maloney, I know, is on TV. And Mary Jo White's now your partner at the law firm where you're working now, and she was U.S. attorney back at Southern, right? No, an SEC director.
Yeah, both.
Right?
She's both.
Both, right? Yeah. So again, part of your book reads like the cast of characters of people at Justice, U.S. Attorney's Office, and the like. And I want you to talk a little bit about your feelings when you had to withhold that information from the both of them. They were your bosses.
There you go. Go ahead.
So, you were taking direction from the judge that you felt that you had to tell him what was going to happen, and you had to hold back.
Yeah, it was a very dicey situation. Just a little bit more backdrop. When we got that call from Gravano, I was taking a longer term view. We were 10 weeks from trial. I didn't need him against John Gotti. I had John Gotti on tape already, and Frank Locascio too. I didn't need Sammy to convict John Gotti. I knew what an important event it would be if he flipped, and I didn't know it was going to happen right away. I didn't know if it would happen after we convicted them. I just didn't want to blow the opportunity. So I made the decision that I was just going to talk to him myself and not tell anybody, because it's just hard to overstate what a spotlight there was on everything back then on this case, because John Gotti was a celebrity boss. I didn't want the information that Gravano had made an overture to be spread any wider than it absolutely had to be, because just suppose he had got back into the jail cell and decided to go to trial thinking maybe he'll flip after the trial's over. Well, if it leaked during the trial that he reached out for me, that would have extinguished that possibility. So I was really taking a longer term view. Of course, it turned out he flipped almost immediately. But for a 2-week period, I didn't tell my boss, Andy Maloney. I didn't tell the chief assistant, Mary Jo White. Both of them, major figures in law enforcement. And that was my call. I wasn't comfortable with it, but I thought it was the right call at the time. Andy was fine with it. Mary Jo was not. And, another thing, Angela, you'll appreciate this. I had been a prosecutor almost a decade. Now I'm in big law for 6+ years. And now I see, Mary Jo is very much a big law person. She came from Debevoise to the Eastern District, is back at Debevoise now, has been at Debevoise, our law firm, in between her public service stints. Now that I'm at the firm, I see that, I'll make the point by exaggeration, associates don't sharpen their pencils without checking in with the partners. So I understand better now than I did then what it meant to Mary Jo to have such a momentous deal be struck by someone who didn't let the partners know, if you know what I mean. So I understand everybody's reaction. I'm really glad Andy was the U.S. attorney, so I didn't get my butt fired. I thought I was exercising the discretion that he vested in me. I turned out to be right about that. But it was, those are not easy judgment calls to make. I made that call. Again, I don't regret that call, but I understand better now than I did then how dicey it was.
So does anybody have any other questions? Because if you don't, I have one more and an anecdote from the audience. Going once, going twice. Okay. So I'm going to ask John one more question, then I'm going to lead into an anecdote. All right, John, you mention him in the book. So it's a small character, but he's listed in the pages up front, which initially I thought, like, why is he listing all these cast of characters? And then you realize that there's a lot of cast of characters in here and got to kind of reference back and forth. So what can you tell me about Roy DeMayo, if anything, what you remembered?
Oh, well, Roy had a crew. Roy was a gangster's gangster himself. Roy had a crew in the Gambino family. For lawyers involved in organized crime, what is remembered most about Roy DeMayo is the case in which Jerry Shargell got disqualified for what they called back then, what Abe Sofair, who was the judge in that case, called being house counsel, for taking money from one person to represent others who might have divergent interests. That's a lawyer's way of saying, to take money from a person against whom your client might cooperate to represent your client. So anyway, Jerry Shargell, the lawyer, later became and is now a very close friend, who had that case with the DeMayo crew, and that's the reason Roy's name is in the book. So now you're going to tell me something about Roy. I feel it coming around the bend.
Yes, it's a funny story. It's a little sad, but okay. But I got to tell it. And I told my good friend Nina Gregory the story. So here's the story. So Roy DeMayo lived in Massapequa, and Roy DeMayo was killed on January 10th, 1983. And they found his body in the back of a car, no shock, right? January 20th, 1983. My father, who was a teacher at Plainedge High School in North Massapequa, died at the high school on January 21st, 1983. And it so happened they were both waked at the same funeral parlor that same weekend. They were the only two wakes at the funeral home. And it was a shock. I was a first-year law student, and my father had a massive heart attack and died in my first year. And there I was at my dad's wake, and there was tons and tons and tons of mafia and FBI agents and people floating into my father's room where my father was laid out, going back and forth between mistaking that room for Roy DeMayo's wake. So it was a moment of weird levity in a very sad time. And I never forgot it and then years later, his son wrote about how his father ruined his life. His son was a couple of years younger than me, went to my high school, but lived in the neighborhood near where Carlo Gambino lived on Club Drive, which was kind of infamous.
There was a point in my life where I probably could have, with one or two phone calls, obtained a photograph of you entering the funeral home that night.
You knew about, he was knocked off. I don't know where in Brooklyn. He knew he was going to be knocked off, but of course I had no knowledge. And yeah, strange. It was a strange thing, because those were the days. I shouldn't even go on like this, but those were the days that wakes went like 3 days as opposed to like one.
Yeah, sure.
And Catholic wakes, my dad wasn't Catholic, but whatever, it was one of those 3-day wakes that shouldn't have gone on 3 days. And as I said, there was law enforcement in the building and mobsters and yeah. So you might have seen me, but not.
Interesting story.
So yeah, that's my connection to Roy DeMayo.
Funny.
But anyway, well, let me also ask at the end, has the reception been to the book? I assume it's been great. And I assume you've been very personally satisfied, for having taken a look back. My closing thoughts on this book was much about your coming of age as it was about the characters within.
That's interesting because, and I think it is, it's inevitably about that because it's 10 years of my life. Although my editor at Scribner, who was terrific, Rick Horgan, kept saying to me, people don't care about John Gleason, write about John Gotti. So there's a lot less there than there used to be. But I guess I'm gratified to hear that there's still some left in there about me. But it is very much about me growing up as a lawyer. But it's all associated with my 9.5 years of investigating and prosecuting either John Gotti himself or the people around him or other mob bosses. And I was so lucky to have those experiences. So I felt almost obligated to write them down because, as you know, I can tell from your comments already, as well as anybody, that was a completely unique time in the history of our city of New York writ large and in the history of organized crime. So I was so happy just to get the book over the finish line. Didn't really think I cared whether it would sell one copy, but of course I'm a competitive guy and I'm happy to report that it's doing great. And thanks to people like you who allow me to talk about it on your show.
Well, thank Danielle and thank Nina. So Danielle, do you have anything to add or?
Yes, there are some questions in the chat. One is from Deb Cornell. Is there any affiliation between the mob and today's known Teamster union?
Not. First of all, thank you, Danielle, for having me.
Thank you for being
on the talk. No, the mob is not gone completely. That is to say, it's not literally extinguished, but it's a complete shell of its former self. And the one thing we did succeed in extinguishing almost completely was the grip the New York mob had on a bunch of critical unions, not just Teamster 282, which controls the trucks getting on construction sites at big, skyscraper projects in New York, but also the docks, the garment center, garbage carting. Those connections have been severed. And that's where the real money in the mob was through labor racketeering. So is there still this standing, Teamster Special Master, I've forgotten the exact title, that was set up in the 70s? Yes, but the significance of that has almost completely diminished because the strength of the connection to corrupt union officials has just been diminished almost entirely, almost severed completely.
Thank you for that. We have one more from Dr. Paige Williams. I wonder how those years of prosecuting the mob influenced your later law career.
Well, they made it a little more boring than it otherwise might be, because there's nothing more interesting than investigating and prosecuting and trying mobsters. But in the end of the day, I'm a lawyer. I'm like a born lawyer, and I do a lot of big time. I do criminal defense now, all kinds of criminal defense, but I do even more commercial litigation, big company litigation. And I like it a lot. And, what those years did for me was we were working 16 hours a day. I got like 20 years of experience as a lawyer crammed into the 10 years I was a prosecutor. And they made me a better lawyer and a more confident lawyer. Lawyers don't have much except a good judgment and, their integrity and a little knowledge of how things work. And, I've managed to hang on to the integrity. I think I've got good judgment. And I learned a lot about how things work by doing all those cases all those years. So, punchline, I'm a really lucky guy and was very lucky to have those experiences, and they've helped me enormously in my career as a judge for 22 years and now back as a practicing lawyer.
Thank you for that, and thank you for your service. I really enjoyed the book. I found it fascinating, considering I had never read a mobster book before, so it was very insightful and very interesting. One of the things, and I wanted to share this with the audience that had me in shock and I couldn't wait to get to the next moment, was when after the first trial you found out that why Gotti had got acquitted. That was a shocker, and I found that was fascinating, and I will put that as a teaser for everyone that's in the audience to grab the book so that you can find out that information.
Thank you, Danielle. I'm very flattered to hear you say those things.
I would also say, when you get the book, go slowly and do not think that go back to it. It's not, there's a lot of characters and it's an easy read, but full of a lot of people, which meant that he had a process, imagine him sifting through it with a big team.
Yeah. And, in a way, my life as a young prosecutor consisted of listening to recorded conversations from different social clubs and Angela Ruggiero's home, and Neil Delacroce's home. And they were all a blur of names of gangsters, nicknames, and union officials. And it was like a blizzard of things to kind of figure out. And there's kind of no avoiding that. The mob is not siloed. The families deal with one another. So early on, it was suggested to me, have a little cast of characters. So if someone does put it down on a Friday night and they pick it up Sunday afternoon and they're wondering exactly, who Vic Arena was as opposed to Tommy O'Sera, they can quickly go up front and get oriented. That's why the cast of characters is there, but in a way that is a great example of how the book reflects reality. It's not a simple world the mobsters live in, by any means.
Well, thank you very much, John. Really loved it. Thank you for your time. Thank you for allowing me to tell you my story. I appreciated it. Again, I'm glad it's selling. I'll cherish it.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I've really enjoyed talking with you, and I hope everybody who reads the book enjoys it. And if you do, feel free to let me know. And thank you again for having me. I'm really grateful. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
What another great interview. Be sure to grab a copy of The Gotti Wars, a must-read for true crime enthusiasts. If you enjoyed this exclusive interview, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell for more captivating true crime stories. And until next time, stay curious and stay safe.